All right, YouTube, if you've been paying attention to the situation in Ukraine, things have taken a turn for the worse in Crimea, actually, the Crimean Peninsula, which is now occupied by Russian forces. Putin, of course, several hours ago, originally there were unknown masked armed gunmen who took an airfield and then another airfield and started coming out of the port and occupying certain buildings. Then communications were cut. People started seeing helicopters roaming through the skies over Ukrainian airspace. And now there are ships in the area. There are aircraft landing at these airfields. There are at least 2,000 troops in addition to the ones that were already there yesterday. And apparently now, the Russian forces are actively planning to assault a military base that's held by Ukrainian soldiers, those loyal to the reigning government in the western region, the one that Russia declares is not valid because Yanukovych is the actual president of the Ukraine, which is clearly false. It's becoming a stickier situation. Originally, it was simply that these individuals in this region of the Ukraine weren't really happy with the decision. They still like Yanukovych. They were already putting up Russian flags and forming citizen groups. Putin seems to have seized on this and upon the fact that this particular region of the Ukraine, Crimea and the southern coastal region and part of the eastern segment of Ukraine. During Soviet times, and there are plenty of people who deny that this happened, but it's clear from history that it did, the Soviet government exiled at least 5 or 6 million, upwards possibly of 10 million ethnic Ukrainians, exiled them from this land, put them in Siberian work camps. Half of them died, the others scattered around the country back when it was the USSR, and used their Russification policy to then take white Russians from the main core of Russia and send them there. They did the same thing in Kazakhstan. They did the same thing in all of these other countries to greater or lesser degrees. They would often resettle people who were impoverished. They didn't necessarily have a job. Good way to get rid of unemployment, I guess. They would put the poor there, some of the upper classers to then attempt to develop the area. Criminals sometimes were former criminals would be resettled in these locations. So yes, when the Russian paid posters, which you're seeing literally everywhere on the internet right now. They've infiltrated basically every website you can think of. When the Russian paid posters say, well, that part of Ukraine is ethnically Russian, they're correct. The reason why it's ethnically Russian is most of the native Ukrainians, not that long ago, in the middle of the 1900s, had been butchered and sent to work camps and never returned in some cases to the Ukraine. It was a mass depopulation called the Holodomor, which people still deny in many regions actually happened. It did. Quite clearly, this is a real thing. To deny the Holodomor is I guess, the Russian answer to Holocaust denial in parts of the Western world. However, Putin may be overplaying his hand here, and here's why. The Ukrainian soldiers are still in that region as well as all over the rest of the Ukraine. Now, nobody's claiming that if Ukraine and Russia went at it like wolves in one-on-one combat that the Ukraine wouldn't be completely destroyed. It would. Russia could easily wipe out all of Ukraine's forces, short of arming every civilian in the country to the best of their ability, which would at most slow them down. And that's not even counting nuclear warfare, because the Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, although they're now threatening to develop them. There is always the possibility that these soldiers at this specific base that they're targeting, apparently the Russians aren't saying, well, we're going to kill them, we're going to execute them. They're saying we're going to disarm these soldiers, so they better stand down. The Ukrainians are saying they're not going to. And that they've already taken up strategic positions to fight if necessary. If shots are fired, and if the Russians steamroll this base and burn it to the ground or kill all the Ukrainians or or take them hostage or anything else happens, that's going to provoke I think Putin knows this too. I think this is actually his plan. I think he's hoping that they will retaliate. Will provoke the corpus of Ukraine, not only them, but the entire EU and the entire Western world at large, to condemn Russian actions. The Ukraine has to choose right now, and with communications down, it's not clear that these particular soldiers are even in communication necessarily on a good basis with the rest of the Ukraine anyway, which makes it even scarier. They have to choose whether they're going to fight, they're going to assert their sovereignty, assert their right to control this particular chunk of land, which is rather productive. It has ports. It's an important piece of land within the Ukraine. Or whether they're going to sit back and say, okay, we'll withdraw our troops, let the Russians take it, we don't care. Then there's another problem. And that's that it's not clear how far Putin intends to expand. It's clear now that the Ukraine has declared that it no longer wants Putin's puppet ruling them. It's clear that at least any area of the Ukraine that remains Western friendly will not be joining the Eurasian Union. That's really what this is about. Putin wants their grain mainly in exchange for natural gas and other commodities. The Ukraine is a breadbasket. It always was when it was part of the Soviet Union. I've said that before. They also have untapped gas reserves of their own that haven't been developed for some reason or another. Europe might choose to develop them down the road. It's not clear whether Putin intends to just take Crimea, or if upon taking that, if he experiences no real resistance other than maybe, people throwing bottles at his soldiers, which he doesn't care, he'll just mow down the civilians too, like he always does. It's not clear that he'll stop there. He might then declare that all areas of the Ukraine that voted for Yanukovych and still at least marginally support him are part of the Russian Federation. Or that he's creating a new independent Ukrainian state within the Russian sphere of influence. It's not clear that he will stop at Crimea. And if the Ukrainians do fight, here's the other thing. If they choose to fight Putin's forces, it's not clear whether Putin is more simply sizing the situation and might even consider withdrawing from Ukraine altogether and cut his losses, or whether he'll keep pushing, and then it's not clear whether the EU and US and all of these Western countries will be willing to invest the sort of diplomatic or physical pressure needed to force Putin back out. Any land that Putin takes and successfully holds for any real period of time presumably is going to end up either becoming its own state, which will be Eastern in sphere, it will be allied with Russia, or he will simply absorb them, annex them entirely. It's a bad thing for the Ukraine right now, what's going on. And Russia has already stated now that they won't cooperate with the interim government because to them, the interim government is illegitimate. Because to Russia, their puppet, Yanukovych, who was embezzling at least hundreds of millions from the public treasury to build all of these luxury things, who at the very least did order that protesters be shot at using live ammunition, which is, I believe, in breach of international law in that specific situation, who at least passed laws that violated the Ukrainian constitution that was set up when the Ukraine became its own sovereign nation. It's clear they believe Yanukovych, this individual, is still the president of the Ukraine. That the interim government formed under the parliamentary procedure is illegitimate, it doesn't have any power, and that they violated some probably non-existent rules in forcing Yanukovych out. And of course, Yanukovych goes over to Russia. He's not even speaking Ukrainian. To this crowd, he's speaking Russian and talking about how he was forced to leave. He's still the president. It wasn't a coup, but he was forced to leave because people were getting violent. I wonder why. Could it be because he was ordering the police to fire on these protesters that largely up until that point had been peaceful? I watched the live stream. I'm sure the people within Russia are just like people within the United States. Most of them watch state media. To us, that's CNN or Fox or something like that, which essentially just parrots what the government wants them to say. Over here, we have a sort of bipolar system by which you've got the right and the left and so forth. But they really basically say the same thing. And in Russia, people are all watching Russia Today and to a lesser extent things like Al Jazeera or something like that. So the Russians are watching their state media. The state media is still talking about how these protesters are largely Nazis, how they're similar to brown shirts, how they're a bunch of violent thugs that are raping women and burning businesses to the ground. And watching the live streams that I saw, and from both sides, by the way, I never saw any of that. You saw a handful of nationalists there that were beating on the police largely to protect the other protesters because they're tired of Yanukovych. And they hate the left and Russia a lot more than they hate the European Union. That's, I guess, what they've chosen. They'd rather be a part of Europe and their sphere rather than the Russian sphere, probably because of increased wealth that would come as a result of that. And Obama came out and gave a live address earlier. It was only a couple of minutes long. It wasn't particularly long. He looked stressed during it. People are now saying, oh, well, he looked weak. He sort of waffled around the issue. He basically gave a half-assed condemnation of Russia going into this sovereign nation and putting troops there and warned against further provocation, just as Russia's warned against further provocation, which is code for if the EU sends troops in, we'll probably target them too and cause World War III. I thought, and I'll give him credit where credit's due. Obama can't just come out and say, well, these Ruskies need to back off. Putin needs to shove a dildo up his ass. It wouldn't be wise to do that at this point because that could just give them further provocation. What Obama and the British and the Polish and the Italians and the Norwegian and the Germans, all of these groups in the Western sphere are doing right now is waiting simply to see what happens with the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians do decide to defend themselves against Russian invasion, because this is an invasion, the Ukrainian government, which is legitimate, did not give the Russians permission to enter this region. There was no problem with them inhabiting the base that they have in Crimea. They are now moving from that base into Ukrainian territory, which is purely Ukrainian. All claims to the contrary about, well, Crimea is part of Russia or these people are ethnically Russian are based on a bunch of goofy lies and largely propaganda. The West will sit back, and this is a tactic they've used before, and hope that Putin comes to his senses and doesn't attempt to advance beyond Crimea, and that he's basically just dick-wagging. He wants part of the Ukraine to have a civil war so that he can gobble up half of it, sort of a compromise. He doesn't get the whole Ukraine, but he gets, the Black Sea port that he wants, and he gets some of the grain. I think that's what they're hoping for. I think everyone's hoping the Ukrainians choose not to fire on the Russian troops, which will cause a war, and tens of thousands of people will die, because the Ukrainians, although they can't stand up to Russia, do possess the capability to seriously hamper Putin's advance, unless Putin decides to put, 1 million conscripts on the ground there. In which case, the EU might literally be forced to take action. The Turkish people might have to take action, the British, the French, the Germans, and probably, let's face it, in such a scenario, probably the United States. We're talking about sanctions on Russia, and all of these things are floating around Washington. It's going to be a strange day in D.C. right now. Just as it's probably a strange day in Kiev and probably a strange day in Moscow, people are probably drunk off their asses right now, worrying if there's going to be a nuclear conflict. This is starting to look similar to the Georgian invasion under the Soviet Union. It's starting to look a little bit like, a Cuban Missile Crisis in the making, possibly. There's a Russian warship hovering around Cuba right now, not far off the coast of Florida. The Iranian ships are still there. This is probably either meant to provoke the United States into saying or doing something stupid, or it's Putin's way of saying, okay, fuck it, I'm not going to get the whole Ukraine. There's no way he's going to march into the West Ukraine. It would be suicide. Russia would get attacked in that case. It would result in a nuclear war. It won't happen. I think Putin's just hoping that the citizens in the East Ukraine rise up, try to form an independent state that he can then back. He can put troops there, and he can split it up, just like what was done with Germany, which is what I think he wants. Hopefully that doesn't happen because, of course, the Ukraine the way the economy in the Ukraine is structured, neither side would really be capable of functioning. The EU would end up propping up the western side. Russia would end up propping up the eastern side. Everyone would become more impoverished as a result, and they would constantly be competing to see who can invest more and make our side of Ukraine look better. It would be just like East and West Germany. They might even try to literally build a wall there. They could go that far. It's retarded. All sides should simply stand back and respect Ukrainian sovereignty. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Russia has already crossed over that Rubicon, so to speak. So hopefully you simply don't see any open fighting, and what you see is simply the best case scenario right now is Putin decides, okay, I've harassed the West enough, and I'm taking Crimea, and you can have the rest. That's about all. Peace out.